Whatever they leave for posterity, will it be, can it be, ever truly understood? History Lesson by Arthur C. Clarke. Read by Karl. No one can remember when the tribe had begun its long journey. The land of great rolling plains that had been its first home was now no more than a half-forgotten dream. For many years, Sean and his people had been fleeing through a country of low hills and sparkling lakes, and now the mountains lay ahead. This summer they must cross them to the southern lands. There was little time to lose. The white tear that had come down from the poles, grinding continents to dust and freezing the very air before it, was less than a day's march behind. Sean wondered if the glaciers could climb the mountains ahead, while in his heart he dared to kindle a little flame of hope. This might prove a barrier against which even the remorseless ice would batter in vain. In the southern lands of which the legend spoke, his people might find a refuge at last. It took weeks to discover a pass through which the tribe and the animals could travel. When midsummer came, they had camped in a lonely valley where the air was thin and the stars shone with a brightness no one had ever seen before. The summer was waning when Sean took his two sons and went ahead to explore the way. For 3 days they climbed, and by 3 nights slept as best they could on the freezing rocks. The fourth morning there was nothing but a gentle rise to a cairn of grey stones built by other travelers centuries ago. Sean felt himself trembling, and not with cold, as they walked towards the little pyramid of stones. His sons had fallen behind. No one spoke, for too much was at stake. In a little while they would know if all their hopes had been betrayed. To east and west the wall of mountains carved away as if embracing the land beneath. Below were endless miles of undulating plain, with a great river swinging across its tremendous loops. It was a fertile land, one in which the tribe could raise crops knowing there would be no need to flee before the harvest came. Then Sean lifted his eyes to the south and saw the doom of all his hopes. For there at the edge of the world glimmered that deadly light he had seen so often to the north, the glint of ice below the horizon. There was no way forward. Through all the years of flight, the glaciers from the south had been advancing to meet them. Soon they would be crushed beneath the moving walls of ice. Southern glaciers did not reach the mountains until a generation later. In that last summer, the sons of Sean carried the sacred treasures of the tribe to the lonely cairn overlooking the plain. The ice that had once gleamed below the horizon was now almost at their feet. By spring, it would be splintering against the mountain walls. No one understood the treasures now. They were from a past too distant for the understanding of any man alive. Their origins were lost in the mist that surrounded the Golden Age. How they had come at last in possession of this wandering tribe was a story that would now never be told. For it was the story of a civilization that had passed beyond recall. Once all these pitiful relics had been treasured for some good reason. Now had become sacred, though their meaning had long been lost. The prints in the old books had faded centuries ago, so much of the legend was still visible, if there had been any to read it. But many generations had passed since anyone had had use for a set of 7-figure logarithms, an atlas of the world, and the score of Sibelius' Seventh Symphony, printed, according to the flyleaf, by H. K. Chu and Sons at the city of Pekin in the year 2371 A.D. The old books were placed reverently in the little crypt that had been made to receive them. There followed a motley collection of fragments, gold and platinum coins, a broken telephoto lens, a watch, a cold light lamp, a microphone, the cutters from an electric razor, some midget radio tubes. The thoughts of them had been left behind when the great tide of civilization had ebbed forever. All these treasures were carefully stowed away in their resting place. Then came 3 more relics, the most sacred of all because the least understood. The first was a strangely shaped piece of metal, showing the coloration of intense heat. It was, in its way, the most pathetic of all the symbols of the past, for it told of man's greatest achievement and of the future he might have known. The mahogany stand on which it was mounted bore a silver plate with the inscription, Auxiliary Igniter of Starboard Jet, Spaceship Morning Star, Earth Moon, AD 1985. Next followed another miracle of the ancient science, a sphere of transparent plastic with strangely shaped pieces of metal embedded in it. At its center was a tiny capsule of synthetic radio element, surrounded by the converting screens that shifted its radiation far down the spectrum. As long as the material remained active, the sphere would be a tiny radio transmitter, broadcasting power in all directions. Only a few of these spheres had ever been made. They had been designed as perpetual beacons to mark the orbits of the asteroids. But man had never reached the asteroids, and the beacons had never been used. Last of all was a flat circular tin, wide in comparison with its depth. It was heavily sealed and rattled when it was shaken. The tribal lore predicted disaster would follow if it was ever opened, and no one knew that it held one of the great works of art of nearly 1,000 years before. The work was finished. 2 men rolled the stones back into place and slowly began to descend the mountainside. Even to the last, man had given some thought to the future and tried to preserve something for posterity. That winter, the great waves of ice began their first assault on the mountains, attacking from north and south. The foothills were overwhelmed on the first onslaught, and the glaciers ground them into dust. But the mountains stood firm, and when the summer came, the ice retreated for a while. So, winter after winter, the battle continued. And the roar of avalanches, the grinding of rock, and the explosions of splintering ice filled the air with a tumult. No war in man had ever been fiercer than this. Even man's battles had not quite engulfed the globe as this had done. At last, the tidal waves of ice began to subside, and to creep slowly down the flanks of the mountain they had never quite subdued. The valleys and passes were still firmly in their grip. It was stalemate. The glaciers had met their match, but their defeat was too late to be of any use to man. So the centuries passed, and presently there happened something that must occur at least once in the history of every world in the universe, no matter how remote and lonely it may be. The ship from Venus came 5,000 years too late, but its crew knew nothing of this. While still many millions of miles away, telescopes discerned the great shadow of ice that made Earth the most brilliant object in the sky next to the sun itself. Here and there the dazzling sheet was marred by black specks that revealed the presence of almost buried mountains. That was all. The rolling oceans, the plains and forests, the deserts and lakes, all that had been the world of man was sealed beneath the ice, perhaps forever. The ship closed into Earth and established an orbit less than 1,000 miles away. For 5 days it circled the planet, where cameras recorded all that was left to see, and 100 instruments gathered information that would give the Venusian scientists many years of work. An actual landing was not intended. There seemed little purpose in it. But on the 6th day, the picture changed. A panoramic monitor, driven to the limits of its amplification, detected the dying radiation of a 5,000-year-old beacon. Through all the centuries, it had been sending out its signals with ever-failing strength as its radioactive heart steadily weakened. The monitor locked on the beacon frequency. In the control room, a bell clamored for attention. A little later, the Venusian ship broke free from its orbit and slanted down towards Earth, to raise a range of mountains that still towered proudly above the ice, and to a cairn of grey stones that the years had scarcely touched. The great disk of the sun blazed fiercely in the sky, no longer veiled with mist, for the clouds that had once hidden Venus had now completely gone. Whatever force had caused the change in the sun's radiation had doomed one civilization, and given birth to another. Less than 5,000 years before, the half-savage people of Venus had seen suns and stars for the first time. Just as the science of man had begun with astronomy, so had that of Venus. Now in the warm, rich world that man had never seen, progress had been incredibly rapid. Perhaps the Venusians had been lucky. They never knew the dark age that held man in chain for 1,000 years. They missed the long detour in the chemistry and mechanics, but came at once to the more fundamental laws of radiation physics. In the time that man had taken to progress from the pyramids to the rocket-propelled spaceship, the Venusians had passed from the discovery of agriculture to antigravity itself, the ultimate secret that man had never learned. The warm ocean that still bore most of the young planet's life rolled its breakers languidly against the sandy shore. So new as this continent, the very sands were coarse and gritty. There had not been time enough for the sea to wear them smooth. The scientists lay half in the water, their beautiful reptilian bodies gleaming in the sunlight. The greatest minds of Venus had gathered on the shore from all the islands on the planet. What they were going to hear they did not know, except that it concerned the third world, the mysterious race that peopled it before the coming of the ice. The historian was standing on the land, for the instruments he wished to use had no level water. By his side was a large machine which attracted many curious glances from his colleagues. It was currently concerned with optics, for a lane system projected from it towards a screen of white material a dozen yards away. The historian began to speak. Briefly, he recapitulated what little had been discovered concerning the third planet and its people. He mentioned the centuries of fruitless research that had failed to interpret a single word of the writings of Earth. The planet had been inhabited by a race of great technical ability. That, at least, was proved by the few pieces of machinery that had been found on the cairn upon the mountains. We do not know why so advanced a civilization came to an end, he observed. Almost certainly it had sufficient knowledge to survive an ice age. There must have been some other factor above which we know nothing. Perhaps disease or racial degradation may be responsible. It has even been suggested that tribal conflicts endemic to our own species in prehistoric time may have continued on this third planet after the coming of technology. Some philosophers maintain that knowledge of machinery does not necessarily imply a higher degree of civilization. It is theoretically possible to have wars in society possessing mechanical power, flight, or even radio. Such a conception is alien to our thoughts, but we must admit this possibility. Will certainly account for the downfall of the lost race. It has always been assumed we should never know anything of the physical form of the creatures who lived on Planet 3. For centuries, our artists have been depicting scenes from the history of the dead world, peopling it with all manners of fantastic beings. Most of the creations resemble us more or less closely, though it has often been pointed out that just because we are reptiles, it does not follow that all intelligent life must necessarily be reptilian. We now know the answer to one of the most baffling problems of history. At last, after 100 years of research, we've discovered the exact form and nature of the ruling life on the third planet. It was a murmur of astonishment from the assembled scientists. Some were so taken aback they disappeared for a while into the comfort of the ocean, as all Venusians were apt to do in moments of stress. This historian waited until his colleagues re-emerged into the element they so disliked. He himself was quite comfortable, thanks to the tiny sprays that were continually planning over his body. With their help, he could live on land for many hours before having returned to the ocean. The excitement slowly subsided, and the lecture continued. One of the most puzzling of objects found on Planet 3 was a flat metal container holding a great length of transparent plastic material, perforated at the edges and wound tightly into a spool. The transparency at first seemed quite featureless, but an examiner with the new subelectronic microscope showed this is not the case. Along the surface of the material, invisible to our eyes but perfectly clear under the correct radiation, are laid thousands of tiny pictures. It is believed they are printed on the dark material by some chemical means and have faded with the passage of time. These pictures apparently form a record of life as it was on the third planet at the height of its civilization. They are not independent. Consecutive pictures are almost identical, differing only in the detail of movement. The purpose of such a record is obvious. It is only necessary to project the screens in rapid succession to give an illusion of continuous movement. We have made a machine to do this, and I have here an exact reproduction of the picture sequence. The scenes you are now going to witness take us back many thousands of years to the great days of our sister planet. They show a complex civilization, many of whose activities we can only dimly understand. Life seems to have been very violent and energetic, and much what you will see is quite baffling. It is clear the third planet was inhabited by a number of different species, none of them reptilian. This is a blow to our pride, but the conclusion is inescapable. The dominant type of life appears to have been a two-armed biped. It walked upright and covered its body with some of flexible material, possibly for protection against the cold, since even before the Ice Age, the planet was at a much lower temperature than our own world. But I will not try your patience any further. You will now see the record of which I have been speaking. A brilliant light flashed from the projector. It was a gentle whirring, and on the screen appeared hundreds of strange beings moving rather jerkily to and fro. The picture expanded to embrace one of the creatures, and the scientists could see the historian's description had been correct. The creature possessed two eyes, set rather close together, but the other facial adornments were a little obscure. There was a large orifice in the lower portion of the head that was constantly opening and closing. Perhaps it had something to do with the creature's breathing. The scientists watched spellbound as the strange being became involved in a series of fantastic adventures. There was an incredibly violent conflict with another slightly different creature. It seemed certain they must both be killed. When it was all over, neither seemed any the worse. There came a furious drive over miles of country in a four-wheeled mechanical device which was capable of extraordinary feats of locomotion. The ride ended with the city packed with other vehicles moving in all directions at breakneck speeds. No one was surprised to see two of the machines meet head-on with devastating results. After that, events became even more complicated. It was now quite obvious that it would take many years of research to analyze and understand all that was happening. It was also clear that this record was a work of art, somewhat stylized, rather than an exact reproduction of life as it had actually been on the third planet. Most of the scientists found themselves completely dazed when the sequence of pictures came to an end. There was a final flurry of motion, in which the creature that had been the center of interest became involved in some tremendous but incomprehensible catastrophe. The picture contracted to a circle centered on the creature's head. The last scene of all was an expanded view of his face, often expressing some powerful emotion. Whether it was rage, grief, defiance, resignation, or some other feeling could not be guessed. The picture vanished. For a moment, some lettering appeared on the screen that it was all over. For several minutes there was a complete silence, save for the lapping of the waves upon the sand. The scientists were too stunned to speak. The fleeting glimpse of our civilization had a shattering effect on our minds. The little group began to start talking together, first in whispers, then more and more loudly, as the implications of what they had seen became clearer. Presently, the Stern called for attention and addressed the meeting again. "We are now planning," he said, "a vast program of research to extract all available knowledge from this record. Thousands of copies are being made for distribution to all workers. You'll appreciate the problems involved. The psychologists in particular have an immense task confronting them. But I do not doubt that we will succeed. In another generation, who can say what we may not have learned of this wonderful race? Before we leave, let us look again at our remote cousins, whose wisdom may have surpassed our own, but of whom so little has survived." Once more the final picture flashed on the screen. Motion this time, for the projector had been stopped. With something like awe, the scientists gazed at the still figure from the past, while in turn the little biped stared back at them with a characteristic expression of arrogant bad temper. For the rest of time it would symbolize the human race. The psychologists of Venus would analyze its actions and watch its every movement until they could reconstruct its mind. Thousands of books would be written about it. Intricate philosophies would be contrived to account for its behavior. But all this labor, all this research, would be utterly in vain. Perhaps the proud and lonely figure on the screen was smiling sardonically at the scientists who were starting on their age-long, fruitless quest. Its secret would be safe as long as the universe endured, for no one now would ever read the lost language of Earth. Millions of times the ages to come, these last few words would flash across the screen, and none could ever guess its meaning. A Walt Disney production. The end.